Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the Kundalini Yoga 3HO community. 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. My name is Guru Nishan, and I started this podcast for several reasons because I was born and raised in this community, and I always read the intentions at the beginning of every episode. So, number one, to break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community in the name of neutrality. Number two, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who have joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have practiced or taught Kundalini Yoga. Number three, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from our community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number four, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number five, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they are doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing victims. Number six, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural appropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and the overall community ethos. Number seven, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number eight, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light-washing mentality. Number nine, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through our community, both named and unnamed. Number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, process their own emotions, to get somatic therapy and other therapy and support as needed, to draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. On today's episode, I'd like to welcome our guest, Mira Harkrishan Khalsa. She was born in 2002 in the Los Angeles ashram. Her parents are Siri Singh and Gobind Kaur Khalsa. She attended Summer Solstice and Khalsa Youth Camp every year growing up. And in 2005, her family moved from Los Angeles to Nambe, New Mexico, to be a part of the Espanola ashram, and because her mother got a job at the ranch, Yogi Bhajan's main property. In 2019, her family moved from the Espanola community to Santa Barbara. In 2020, she decided to change her name to Mira. I want to welcome you to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, Mira. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's really a delight, when you reached out several months ago and just shared your experience listening to the podcast.
Definitely. But it's so interesting because because I'm so young and I grew up in a time when Yogi Bhajan wasn't really alive. Like I've never even met him. And but it's interesting to see like the ways that I still grew up in his teachings, if that makes sense.
It makes so much sense. And talking to you like that like ripples through me like, wow, yeah, you're a child that never met YB, and yet you
Yep.
get to have this lens that is very much permeated within the experience of the community and his
But
ones.
yeah, but definitely I feel that like as the time that I have grown up, that it's just relaxed a lot compared to like you guys growing up, because I was listening, I think, to one of the podcasts with you and another lady, and you were saying how you had a huge issue like starting to wear pink for the first time or something like that. And like I grew up wearing pink and like different colors and stuff like that. Like it like my
Cool.
growing up, like my childhood was a lot like more relaxed compared to people in the 80s and stuff like that.
What a good
Yeah.
perspective. Thank you for bringing that up because it's so true. Like the decades later, everything totally relaxed. Colors were already
Yeah,
in. Women
definitely.
were wearing turbans with their ears out and house
Oh yeah.
turbans, you know.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like I was even looking at like a lot of pictures of me at Goodwara, and like all of my like Bana was like different colors and stuff like that. It was never all white and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating. So
Hmm.
so tell us how old you are. Tell us your year frame again
Okay,
when
so
you were born. Like, get us started.
right now I'm 19. I was born in 2002 in Los Angeles. And so I was born at a time when Yogi Bhajan was still alive. And so he was able to give me my name growing up, Harkrishan. But I like when I was born, he was right about to go into a surgery. I don't know what it was for because he was in really bad health at the time. But I know that there was like a boy who was born 3 days after me, probably Joe, and he had to wait like a month to get his name
Interesting.
because yeah, because YB was in a surgery, but I was able to get mine like right away. Hmm. But also like it was so interesting because like I think 2 years after I was born, he died. But even still, like the people that were like I guess like didn't get named by him, like it was still like very common to be like, oh, like well you weren't named by him, so like oh like you missed out a bit or something like that.
That was like status.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, definitely,
It
definitely
hadn't
to be.
the naming formula hadn't been passed on yet.
Yeah, because also like we've all so like me and other friends have talked about like the names that like Narinjan, or I think that's his name, has given compared to like YB, and we're like, oh, they're kind of weird, like they're a little bit different. Yeah.
You should give everybody perspective that's listening. There was a YB named everybody. So what Mira's discussing is that when a child was born, then YB would get called, which we've heard in other podcasts, and of course we know in our
Mhm.
community. But when he passed, I don't know what happened in the community, but at some point, how long it took.
Yeah. Well, I know that
Narinjan took over the formula of some sort.
yeah. And now like even if you go on 3HO's website, like you can pay a certain amount and like get a name. So they've really like capitalized on that.
And that's really interesting because it would be a really interesting who would know what that story was from the time that he passed to when it became a marketing tool, even
Yeah.
more so from YB having this naming formula to now Narinjan got this thing special formula passed to her, and then they
Yeah.
monetized on it, and it's essentially cultural appropriation at its finest.
Really, yeah, it really is. And it's just like, because, well, I don't know if they charge people in the community, but because I know, like, now, like, if anyone, like, if I guess, especially the yoga students, if they want to get a name, like, they can just go on 3HO and get one. If they pay money, obviously.
Which is horrible, right? But I'm sure hopefully in the community people find their own unique ways to come up with their children's names.
Yeah, I
Leading
think
the city
also
you're
like
not or something.
I think also after like YB died, like some people didn't like, I don't necessarily know too many like people, but I think like there was one like woman in our community who named her son on her own. but it couldn't. I don't really know. Like I don't, because I don't really know like many of the new parents, I guess. So I don't ask them like, oh, where do you get your name for your kids?
Well, I'm guessing that the monetization of the names came through the yoga student direction because
Yeah,
they
yeah,
needed
yeah,
to carry that
definitely,
on,
definitely.
and they found a way obviously to pass that baton on to Narinjan. Again, it would be interesting if anybody's listening and knows how this went down within the organizational breakdown. It would be an interesting podcast to have in the future. But let's keep
Oh
it
yeah,
pointed on
definitely.
you, sis. So keep going. So
Okay, sounds good.
you tell us where you want to go with this.
Okay, so I have notes about like my dad, and then I can talk about my mom a bit. So essentially, like my dad, he was born in Los Angeles in 1955. So he's of like the baby boomer generation. And his parents were pretty like upper class. His dad has served in World War II. And so they were like, I in one of my classes at university, I finally like kind of understood it. Like his parents wanted a simple life, and then he wanted more in life, and so he went off to university at the University of Oregon, and so he took his first Kundalini yoga class like for his PE credit at university. And
Mm.
so it's like, and like once he started to take that class, then he like got more into yoga. And then I think like my dad also told me about like the story of his first time meeting Yogi Bhajan. And I think like he went down to Los Angeles from Oregon after like taking a couple of yoga classes. And he went to like this party in Los Angeles. I think it was at the gym at like right across from the ashram on Pico, like Pico Robertson area.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was really really worried about like if there was going to be enough food to eat at the like soiree or whatever it was. And then like Yogi Bhajan came in, and my dad was expecting like a small Indian man, but he wasn't that. And then Yogi Bhajan came up to him and said like, did you have enough to eat, son, or something like that. So Yogi Bhajan like knew exactly what my dad was thinking, even without my dad telling him. But thinking like looking back at it now, I think my like Yogi Bhajan was probably just reading my dad's body language. Yeah. Because he was a customs inspector. And so
Classic.
that's probably what it was, because my dad was so blown away by this.
I see. So this was like a big thing about like what got him connected. Like, wow, he knew what was going on inside of
Yeah.
me. This is my teacher,
Yeah.
so to speak. What
Yeah.
year was this? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know. With the years, I'm not very like
But just in
clear, but
general, do you know what like when your parents were?
he started university, I would say like roughly around like 1973, 19, like because that's when he was like 18. And so I think he probably started to join the community around like 1973.
Okay.
Because also like after 2 years at the University of Oregon, he dropped out and he went to UCSB. And at UCSB, he met like another guy in 3HO, and they became like really good friends, and they still are really good friends. Jai Paul,
Okay.
anyone knows who that is? And they kind of like they went to UCSB together, and they like practiced yoga, and they kind of like got more devoted together, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, you're just sharing some context about him. You can't tell your dad's
yeah,
story.
yeah.
You can
And
just give
then
some context.
yeah, and then my mom, she was born in Canada, and her parents were like Dutch immigrants. And so they like fully lived through World War II and then escaped from that and like started their life in Canada. And my mom is like, she's very private about her life when she was in her 20s, but I know that she ended up in the Vancouver ashram. And I don't know what, I don't know how, but she did. And I think she started taking Kundalini yoga classes in university in Ontario.
Mm.
And then she got her name in Toronto, but I don't necessarily know the dates for that. But I also know that like my dad, he lived in like the San Diego ashram for a bit, and then he lived in the LA ashram for a bit. And in the LA ashram, he was engaged to a woman for like a couple of years, but he never got married to her. I think her name was Hari Har.
Interesting.
And it
Okay.
was because like YB set it up, or he set up the engagement, but they never got married. And then this man was visiting from Vancouver, and I think he was a Punjabi guy. and he recommended to Yogi Bhajan that like my dad should marry my mom. He said, oh, you should marry Gobind from Vancouver. And my dad thought that she was like Punjabi, and he didn't want to necessarily marry like a Punjabi woman. But then like he found out that she was Canadian, and so he was like open to it. And so I think they met each other at the Solstice in 1987, and they did like a day of tantric, and then they got engaged and got married in December of 1987 on December 6th.
Okay.
And I remember my mom saying that she got married on that day specifically because it's like the day that they have like the 6th of the month Gurdwara for the attack on the Akal Tucket on, I think, June 6th in the 80s or something.
Okay.
Because every year, like growing up, there would be a Gurdwara on every 6th of the month. And so my mom wanted to have like those community times on her wedding anniversary.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is how they joined. And did they, when they got married, did they move to LA then?
Yeah, my mom like moved to LA. My dad didn't move to Vancouver, and so they like lived and worked in LA for a while. They worked for Yogi Bhajan. I think like for 10 years at least, like they didn't get paid at all. And then they also had a woman who was living in their house with them for like 10 years, like who didn't, and the woman didn't have to pay rent. It was because Yogi Bhajan said they had to do that, you know. So anything he said, like they had to do. And then I think like 10 years later, they had my sister in 1997.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was, my mom said that that's when she started to get paid by Yogi Bhajan and everything like that. And my mom also worked as his driver for a bit in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so your sister was born in 97. What's your sister's name?
Siri Porn.
Serious and porn. Okay. And then, okay. So then a few more years later, you're born.
Yeah, in 2002 in Los Angeles again. But then after, like when my sister was born, the woman also moved out of the house too. So she wasn't living there. And then also there was there's another story that my dad, because my dad told me like a lot of stories about YB growing up, and like growing up, like after I heard some of them, I was a little like, okay, like why would you let this man like tell you that a woman has to live with you guys rent free for 10 years? That's just so controlling and kind of toxic. But I didn't really say this to them, but I just kind of thought it growing up. And then my dad was also telling me about like how he had a house party something like that in Los Angeles, and he tried to like not invite Yogi Bhajan, but then like Yogi Bhajan showed up anyway, and he's like, and my dad learned like, oh, you can't have a party without like inviting him or else he'll know, because word just like spreads around or something like that.
I see.
Yeah.
I think it was quite common for different people to live with different people for long periods of
Yeah.
time, but especially if he sent them, so that would make sense. And
Yeah.
I know that you're speaking to like now a context like why would you have somebody live with you? Why would you, rent free? Like it just doesn't have the same context, but it was just so
Yeah.
common.
Yeah, and my dad also lived in, I think, an ashram before then, and I'm just like hearing stories about and the ashrams, and I'm like, oh boy.
I can only imagine. Like, so you're getting the stories like from this nostalgia point of view, like your parents, your dad reminiscing to you about the way it
Oh
was.
yeah.
Let me tell you about the ashram life, right?
Oh yes. Oh yes. And so I just kind of like we just kind of like heard we like everyone in my like age group growing up like just heard stories about Yogi Bhajan, but it's not like we ever really interacted with him. Yeah.
So
Because also I was going to talk about like when I was at KYC, they would also tell like
tell us what
stories about,
KYC is.
okay, KYC is Khalsa Youth Camp. And so essentially like every summer after like the summer solstice yoga festival, which was like the giant yoga festival in New Mexico with like 2,000 people, most of them are yoga students coming to do tantric. I don't know how to really explain tantric, but we can try. And then Khalsa Youth Camp is just like the camp after that, which is like an overnight camp for kids. And I went there growing up, and then I also worked there like every year from when I was like 12 to 17 as a guide.
And were you a guide to the other children then in children's
Yeah,
camp?
I was a guide to like the girls age 5 to 8.
Okay,
Yeah.
fascinating. And
It yeah.
no, keep going. Yeah, keep sharing.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And so yeah, like I grew up going to Khalsa Youth Camp when I was like a little girl. So I went there like every year. I think I started going when I was 5. And then when I was 11, I took like a little break. And then when I was 12, I was able to go back there and work every year like as a guide.
Okay.
And until like I was 17. And then when I was 18, like because of COVID, like I couldn't go back there, but I would have.
Hmm. So,
Yeah.
what you're saying is that, like, from your perspective, like growing up in it and stuff, in general, it's like this huge yoga festival in New Mexico at the Solstice site, but it's a
Hmm.
lot of yoga students. So it's of course everybody
Oh
in the
yeah.
community that comes from every ashram, but
Oh
it's a
yeah.
lot of yoga students that are all coming to do the 3 days of tantric and just to be there for the
Yeah,
meeting and
and
stuff.
like I don't necessarily know if you agree with this, but like growing up, like I never thought like the yoga students were like a part of like 3HO, if that makes sense. Because
I
they're
just want
just
you to
like,
share because I haven't been. I
yeah,
mean, it's such a different decade. I just want to hear
okay.
what it was like for you.
Okay, sure. Because like growing up, like I would just kind of like hang out with my Solstice kids, and there would just be like many like I guess like yoga students, if you could call them, who would like do Kundalini yoga like outside of 3HO, but we never really like thought of them as like Sikhs because like they were only really there for like the yoga festival aspect part of it. Like for example, like most of them would just like come to morning sadhana and then they would like leave for Gurdwara, and so we didn't like necessarily like view them as like a part of our community, or like that's at least what I viewed,
Sure.
what I thought. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and solstice is fun. I mean, every summer you get to
Oh my
go,
god, it
you
was
get to see all your
so much
friends from
fun.
around the world, right? Tell us about the experience of it.
Okay, yeah, I would love to. So essentially, like I've been to Solstice like literally every year of my life since I was a baby, because my parents took me every year of my life. And so like growing up going to Solstice, I always loved it because I was able to see like my 3HO friends from like Los Angeles and like New Mexico and all like different parts of the US like at that time every year. And also like one of the reasons why I also really like Solstice is because like I didn't feel the need to like hide who I was, because at like my elementary school growing up, like I was never like fully truthful about like my religion and my background.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So, meaning growing up like in Los Angeles and then later
And
on
in New
in
Mexico.
Mexico, right? So you're
Yeah.
basically saying growing up, you went to public school, so you never got to
Well,
really ever felt,
I I've never been to public school. I've always been to like private school.
okay.
But like at my private school, like for elementary school growing up, like it wasn't, I didn't necessarily feel the need to like fully hide myself, because like the kids there knew that I wore a head covering, they knew that I was Sikh, but they didn't like necessarily fully understand it, and I didn't fully understand it, so I wasn't fully like truthful with them. And then when I was in grade 7, I went to a boarding school in Canada for a couple years. And there, like, I like never wore a head covering. I never talked about my religion. Like, I didn't really want people to know like what was going on like at home,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's so different. And like none of the people there were really like because in New Mexico, like because I was going to elementary school in New Mexico, like I feel like at that point, like enough people in New Mexico knew that there was like a giant like Sikh community, because there's like other like Sikh people in New Mexico that like people from my like class knew, and they weren't necessarily Sikh. And so they weren't necessarily like bullying me for being Sikh. They knew, like they understood it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I was also like listening to podcasts of like students in the 80s who like had to go to public school in Espanola and had like horrible experiences, but like I never had that with like my school in Espanola, because like they had like already known and like accepted us at that point.
Right, but then you're also speaking to the fact that when you went to a different public school somewhere else, you didn't necessarily wear a
Mhm.
turban, you didn't necessarily identify as those things, because
Yeah.
what I'm hearing you say is that within you, you were confused enough on how to explain it, much less validate it and have a stance on it. You didn't go to school in India, so was that an element to it? Was like you didn't feel like,
Yeah, that was also, like, an element to it, and also, like, when people ask me, like, "Where'd you get your name from?" Like, I was never completely honest about it. I would say, like, "Oh, like, my parents gave me it from India because they liked it," or something like that.
oh,
Or I'd say, like
classic.
yeah.
Tell us why. Tell us about that.
Like, just because I just got so tired of people asking me, like, "Your name is so beautiful, like, where does it come from?" And I'm just like, "Ugh." So I just like, my go-to line was like, "It's from India and my parents liked it. That's why they named me it."
Yeah, so you're
And
just talking about simple story because you just don't want to have
yeah,
to explain it.
yeah, because, like and, like, I never told people, like, it wasn't my parents who named me, it was this other guy who named me. And, like, sometimes, like, people would ask me, like, the meaning of my name. I told some people and I would, like, tell some other people, like, "Oh, I forgot the meaning of it," or something like that. Because the meaning that Yogi Bhajan gave me was that it means the princess who is God herself, her Christian. But, like, for some people, like, I thought, like, "Oh, I shouldn't tell them," or so it all depended how I felt and how I felt about the person. But for the most part, like, growing up, like, I wasn't necessarily truthful about my identity.
Sure. It
Yeah.
sounds like just depending on the environment that you were in.
Yeah,
So what you were
definitely.
saying was that when you were in when you were at Solstice, it was like finally
Oh,
a
yeah,
place
like
where you felt like you belonged and it was easy to just be yourself and you felt like,
yeah, like, everyone knew, like, everyone there was from, like, the 3HO community, everyone there already knew, like, my name, and so it wasn't like I had to explain anything to anyone. So it was like it was a really fun time, and I love Solstice, and so, like, I, would go to Solstice, like, every year, and then, like, I would, because also, like, I think that in the 80s and stuff like that, like, growing up, they didn't have, like, that great of activities for the kids, but, like, now, they have, like, really, really good activities for the kids. So, like, growing up, like, I did all this fun stuff with Solstice, like, we would go, like, to the ropes course, like, rafting, going, like, to the Chavez Center and all this stuff. So it was like a children's camp, like, it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Much less you see all your friends from all over the world that all come there in one
Exactly,
place. I mean,
exactly.
we're talking about cool, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. So, and then you obviously got to be a guide, which is interesting because I
Mhm.
did that too. So it's like that's quite common, right?
Oh my god! Oh, that's so funny. But it was interesting because so, like, basically, like, I started to notice that, like, when I so, okay, let's also put this into context. Like, my grandfather, I think I already told you this before, like, he wasn't in 3HO, and, like, none of my grandparents or extended family, like, was ever in 3HO. So, like, growing up, like, I had, like, so much of an influence to, like, other and exposure to other types of cultures other than 3HO when I would, like, go see my family for holidays and stuff like that. And my grandfather, he was the one who would, like, pay for my education growing up. And he, like, never wanted me to go to MPA because he knew about 3HO and he had never approved of my dad's lifestyle. And so he had never, like, allowed me to go to MPA. And my parents, like, knew somewhat about the bullying there, and they knew that, like, MPA doesn't necessarily, like, set people up for a college education, so they never, like, forced me to go there. But, like, I didn't really want to tell people this, like, who would ask me, like, "Why don't you go to MPA?" So I would just be like, "Oh, like, it's hard."
You mean your
Yeah.
friends that were going?
Yeah, because I started to especially notice that, like, when I stopped how do I say this? Like, when I went to my other boarding school in Canada, and then when, like, a lot of, like, the 3HO kids growing up, like, when they all, like, went to MPA, like, I wasn't necessarily, like, friends with them anymore at Solstice. And, like, when I would go back to Solstice, I would hang out with a lot of, like, the yoga students' kids
Oh, wow.
who weren't, like, in 3HO. Yeah.
Oh, and how come? Is that because you just didn't go, so you didn't click with
Like it was
anybody, or
just
what?
that like the people coming from they would also like, so like I knew some of the people in 3HO like coming back from MPA, like especially like the people that I grew up with, but I didn't know like a lot of like the people that were coming from MPA, especially like the foreigners who are coming from Europe and like other parts of the world. And so I just didn't know them. I just didn't have the experiences. And so they were just, we just didn't have much in common anymore. And so I like, it kind of like, I just kind of like naturally the distance like
Mm-hmm.
grew, if that,
Sure.
but it's not like I blame them or anything like that. Like I,
It was just kind of what started happening in terms of friend groups.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
Hmm.
so you're saying the yoga students who would be the regulars coming to Solstice year
Yeah,
after
yeah, yeah.
year, those kids would be coming back year after year, and
Yeah,
you'd
yeah.
have those friendships and relationships.
Yeah, like I started to become closer friends with them.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense because
Hmm.
you're having more similar experiences of probably being, quote, conscious and going to school, right?
And you're not, and plus like I was going to like all American schools and they were going to, well, not like American schools but like Canadian schools, so it was like it was very, it's much more, I just had more in
Your
common
own
with them.
experiences. Mhm.
Yeah, but also I wanted to say that like even growing up, like my parents were like first generation, but since they waited like so long to have kids, like they're kind of older parents, if you may say.
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of the people or a lot of the kids right now in like 3HO, like they're all like third generation already. Like their parents went to MPA, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff. Their grandparents are in 3HO.
You're talking about your peers
Yeah.
have that to be the case, but that
Yeah. But
in
for
this
me,
case, your parents were the first
yeah.
generation. They just, yeah, exactly, that makes sense. So you're saying
Hmm.
your peers, their parents were born in 3HO, went to MPA, or went to the school in India. They're several generations in, even though that's not your story with your parents.
Yeah.
Fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah. It really is. And so like growing up, I kind of did also feel like it's okay. Like, it's not that I'm mad about it at all, especially like with what's going on in New Mexico now, like with Siri. Like, I love her so much, and I'm so like,
Let's send a
because
blessing.
I
Let's
know
listen to her family and everyone. Surya
definitely
and she was your friend.
she was.
She was a sister and daughter
She
of
really
family.
was. She really was, and like it really affected me hearing about her.
Yeah.
Because I was very like close with her before like before we went to boarding school. Like growing up, we were both very close.
Mm.
We both have a story of us like at Khalsa youth camp where where like I don't even know how she got away with this, but we both like decided that we didn't want to go to like sadhana or gurdwara, and so she went to like we went to the bathroom together and we were just hanging out, and I think I got nervous at a point so I left, but she was in the bathroom for like all of sadhana gurdwara and then breakfast, so she missed breakfast and no one noticed. But it's so interesting because like I like when I was 12, I started to be like a junior guide in training, and like we literally watch those girls so much now. And so I don't, so Siratma would like never be able to get away with that now. So it was just so funny. Yeah.
You're saying you as a guide, you watched all your young ladies so much more than those who were watching over you ladies.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Like it got much more strict when like I was a guide compared to like when I was a camper.
Nice reflection.
Yeah. But also like when I would be a guide, like so a lot of like the like MPA people that I grew up with, like a lot of them didn't want to come to work at like KYC to be a guide because it was a lot of like stress and like time pressure, and like you're not getting much sleep because they were already at like MPA for the entire year, so they wanted that time to like relax. So most of all, like I would be like working at KYC with a lot of like, it was like a norm for kind of to have like the MPA graduates to work at KYC that summer. But it was like kind of interesting because I wanted to just stress that I've been a camper literally since I was 5 years old, but still, like, I felt like I was treated like I was more like inferior than like the MPA graduates who had like never been to KYC before, just because I didn't go to MPA.
Mm,
Yeah,
interesting. So there was,
yeah.
what you're saying is there was this like internal ethos that you weren't as special because you weren't among this group that had graduated from or attending MPA.
Yeah, because it's also like I think at KYC, like even now, like it was really much a camp that prepares you for MPA, or they're kind of like, oh, like we're sending you to this camp in hopes that you guys go to like MPA when you're older or something like that. Or so
Whoa. So you're saying
yeah.
that it was like a part of the training system built into
Yeah.
attending the and so yoga students eventually would have their children go too, so to speak.
Yeah, to KYC. But it was interesting because also like sometimes like some MPA students would like come up to me and be like, "Oh, why didn't you go there?" And I'm just be like, "Oh, like I never knew what to say. That was the problem. I never knew what to say."
Mm.
Yeah.
But you later found out it was because your grandfather had put a stipulation that he
Well,
would pay
like
for it
I
if
I knew that, but I didn't want to necessarily tell them that.
so you did know that the stipulation was your grandfather was paying for your schooling as long as it wasn't there.
Yeah, like I knew that, but I didn't necessarily want to, because I feel like it was too like complicated to explain to some people about that, so I didn't want to like. So I don't necessarily know what I would say, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say? That's a real family internal thing. It's not necessarily that you just spew
Hmm.
anywhere, but even the fact that you were aware of it is interesting to me.
Yeah. And even like at KYC, I remember there was like one guy I think who told me, he was like asking me like, why didn't you go to MPA? Because he went there for 1 year, but he didn't like it. So, but he said like, oh, everyone in our community should go to MPA even if they don't like it. And I was like, okay, interesting.
Totally interesting.
Yeah. I don't know why like we should go to a school for 1 year even if we're supposed to hate it. But
What I hear you sharing quite a bit is that, that the overall remembrance of growing up was that there was this kind of direction that was kind of the thing to do, and then over time when that wasn't what you did, then the relationships shifted, but you still had good and deep relationships from the growing up years, but it just kind of, as the boarding school years, just like in any adolescent years, so to speak, relationships can shift,
yeah.
but that there
But
was a distinct energy around if you were the among this special group or not.
yeah, because also like at Solstice and stuff like that, like people like from MPA like are always treated like really, really well. If you notice, like, because like there's like the MPA night where like they have like I think you talked about it in a previous podcast at Solstice where they have like the demonstration to get everyone to go there. And it's always like really impressive. And usually like after that, like even like some people are like, oh, that would be fun for a year. Like even like so many people are drawn into it. Yeah.
Yeah, the mystique and the I think it was just so beautifully well done, and I haven't been to Solstice, Mira, so I really like to hear your
Okay.
experience of your experience there, because the more we can hear
Okay.
your experience, the more fascinating it is. I only know
Okay.
my experience at the European Yoga Festival, and I feel very much the same way. I was like drawn in. It was so beautiful, even just the persona of our
Oh
youth was
yeah.
really powerful and potent, and so it's cracked me open over the last year to really witness the incredible amount of locked up pain inside because these stories haven't had a space to be shared. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that there's not actually good experiences, but when we're having such the projected persona and inside we're holding on, like, whoa, that blew my mind, because I know what you're talking about. Like they would have the MPA night and they would do these amazing
Oh
demonstrations,
yeah.
kind of this radiance that these young
But
men and women
e-
held, and yet then to hear the stories of what's actually happening kind of
oh
was
yeah, yeah,
really
yeah.
hard.
Like Yeah. Like if you, I think if like I listened to Jimena's story, and that was like, oh my goodness, hearing about that because she worked at MPA. But
I just
even
mean
like,
like your experience of being
okay, yeah,
you and having
yeah.
that around you, and what you had like, you know,
Well,
watching
I
the
always
NBA
like
nights every year your whole life.
yeah, literally every year. But every year, like I always got like really entranced, and I kind of did wish that I was up there. But then like after Solstice, I knew like, oh, like I shouldn't go. Like it kind of ended for you. Like it's very much a temporary feeling for a lot of people. Because then I knew like, oh, okay, like no, I have to go back to my normal life and get like my education for university, which is what I did. And even just thinking about it now, like there was at Solstice, like there was like at every event, like literally every event, like there was incorporated like MPA thing, like the international party, like probably the Gurdwara, the peace prayer day, they had like the dancing, and then like the torch run where everyone runs up to the Solstice site. And then they have like they have MPA students like leading sadhanas, like I don't know, like every day, but like some days that they're there, and like leading tantric exercises. And like a lot of Solstice is like focused around like MPA and like showing off like the students from MPA. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that they probably have a beautiful marketing plan
they do, because
and
I
they're
think they,
marketing well.
and also they added they added this recently, like when I was a camper, they added in like a day. Okay, because like when you're once you get to like the teens program at Solstice, like basically like you only have to do one day like focused to Kundalini yoga, which is like your day of tantric, but every other day is like fun activities. So Solstice is like really fun for like kids. And then I think when I was like 16 or 17, they added in like a day where you had to do like MPA day at the ranch, where like all the teens would like go down to the ranch, and they would like have like they would like essentially like show us what MPA was like in order to get like people from Solstice to go to MPA.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's a great pool. All the yoga students have their kids there, and all the people from around the world who are participating in Kundalini Yoga, 3HO, or Sikh Dharma at any level that are coming in that have their youth there. It's a huge pool to reach, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really,
Uh,
I guess it is really interesting to think about it now. But then, like, once I got to when I was, I think, 17, like, I knew that that day was there. And then I'm like, no, I'm just going to ditch it. I'm not going to go to PE anyway. Yeah. And then also, like, it was funny because at Solstice, like, like people, especially in my like age group, I don't know if I should say this, but we were really like economical at like paying for Solstice events without actually like paying for them, because we feel like since we're part of the community, like it's kind of like our right to be there, if you know. But and then like and so so like for example, like a lot of like people would just like not pay to go into tantric, and they would just like wait until like they don't check like their badges and just like go in and stuff like that. Like no, like people part of like 3HO, like not necessarily the yoga students.
yeah, not the
And the
yoga students. You're talking right now about people that are like born and raised in
yeah,
3HO,
yeah.
living
Like
in the ashrams, and like basically kind of this knowing like, hey, this is our ashram, and you think you're going to charge us to do the thing that's happening in our
oh
life
yeah,
every day,
yeah,
right?
exactly. And then also like my mom, since she would work for um she worked for one of like the companies, so she got every year she got a free soul, so she literally just gave her badge to me.
Every year she gets a free soul. So let's pause here and like really explain for those that don't know the rates and the costs. What you're basically saying is that when someone goes to Solstice, do you know the cost by chance?
I don't necessarily know the cost because it's like different for your age group and for your
But let's say
um
around 500.
but
There's a
no, but
couple's
it's like I
price.
think like it's like 800 if you're going like alone as an adult. I
Okay,
think
so like
I
an
believe.
$800 price range. So if you're an adult single, around 800, there's probably like a double price of a little over 1,000 for a couple, right? And then there's like a
Hmm.
youth rate, and then there's like a toddler rate or something, right?
And then there's also like a day pass rate and stuff like that. And there's also like a rate if you want to do like white tantric yoga, because you have to like white tantric yoga is like mainly what people are paying for. Because I think like events like Peace Prayer Day are free. But
So basically, people are paying for the days of tantric, and so they have the badge, they have the wristbands. And what you're saying is like, okay, after they don't check, there were certain people that would go
yeah,
in,
like the
and because
people
as
in
young people, if you wanted to take it, oftentimes that's why you would be a youth camp lead, right? So that you could get free
oh yeah,
solstice, right?
yeah, like they also had so many like at Solstice they had so many like work programs where you could like work for free in order to like get like a free solstice. But even like when I was working at 3H KYC, like I was being paid like I didn't do it to exchange my solstice, but like they really don't pay you much, especially for how much you're working.
Got it. Okay, so you didn't do an
Yeah.
exchange because you always got it because your mom was working there, right?
Yeah, no. Yeah, but like it was also like it's I kind of also got like a little bit of like status because of my mom's work growing up. So some like there was one year where I didn't go to Solstice, but I like went with a family friend to go register and I really wanted like a tantric bag. And like the guy like wouldn't give one to her for me. And so she tells him like her mother her mother like built this site, so you better give it to her. And so he's like, okay, like I'm not looking, just take one or something like that. But like yeah, so like I would definitely use my mom to get like more status at Solstice and stuff like that. And especially like if I didn't get like what I want or something like that, I would be like, okay, well I'll just like tell my mom about this or something like that, because she was also my mom's also kind of scary. And
Classic. Okay, on that note, tell us what your mom did for work. Why'd you move?
okay,
You moved to New Mexico. What was your mom doing for work?
okay, yeah. So we moved to New Mexico in 2005 because my mom was working for LYF, which stands for Legacy of Yogi G Foundation. And essentially, like that company just focuses on all the properties that he had in New Mexico and in Los Angeles. And so she was like the property manager of all the like I think yeah, so all the properties in New Mexico and in Los Angeles. So the ranch, RDP, which is like the site for Solstice, and then the Gurdwara, and then like the Secretariat, and some of like the different other residences in Los Angeles. And so like that's what
Tell,
she did.
tell us the
Yeah.
name of that company again.
LYF, Legacy of Yogi G Foundation.
The Legacy of Yogi G Foundation, which basically whole is the manager that oversees all the properties from LA into New
Yeah.
Mexico and any other
But
ones under this umbrella.
I also want to say that like my mom will I'm probably not going to get this like fully correct, but from what I got growing up, like she was never treated well in her job, and many people didn't like her because of how well she would do her job. Yeah. And so actually like I think like a couple years before we moved out of New Mexico, like she was completely like reassigned, if that makes sense. And she was given on the task of like doing the archives of Yogi Bhajans, and she was like taken away from the properties, which is what she actually really liked, and given the archives. So then she had to like but she was actually really good at that too. So what she did was like she completely went to the community college in Santa Fe, and she got like the skills needed to become a photographer in order to take the pictures of Yogi Bhajan's stuff, like all of his stuff. He had so much stuff. I cannot
Okay,
like
so pause. So you're saying she went from being taking care of the properties when you first moved there to being in
yeah,
charge of, quote, the archives. That means
yeah,
all of the things that were ever given to him and all of the belongings.
Yes.
So go ahead. So she's taking pictures of all of it as a part of her
Yeah,
job.
yeah, yeah. Like like so essentially like she had to go to the community college, but she did it. Like she went to the community college and learned how to like do these skills in order to become like a photographer, to take pictures of all of his stuff. Like I don't necessarily know like he had so much stuff. I don't necessarily know where
Name
to
some of the things.
begin.
Name some of the things in the
Like
archive.
okay, so cuz I like growing up also, like my mom would let me come into the dome with her to work and to clean it sometimes. And that the dome is where he like
The
slept. And
dome is where he slept, right? We hear a
yeah.
lot of stories. If you're listening to any of the survivor stories, you hear about the dome a lot. You know, if you hear about
So
the,
yeah, like I've been into his bedroom a lot too, like just because that's where my mom worked.
okay.
And so like he had like a nice bedroom in the dome, and then he had like a huge, okay, sorry. And then he had like a huge bathroom, which like with like a huge bathtub, and then they have all of his clothes there in his closet, and they're all dry cleaned. And then you walk through like the hallway a bit, and then in the hallway like all of his like spears and like shit is kind of like on the wall to be displayed. And my mom took pictures of all of that. And then you walk into his kitchen and there's just more stuff. Like I don't even know like what it is. Like
Just
it's just stuff, but it's expensive. So yeah.
keep naming it. If
No,
you remember
but
it, we want to hear
it's
it.
it's like spears and like weapons, and then there's like just different sculptures. And then you walk into the kitchen, and then there's like the entrance, and then you're in his living room. And then in his living room, I think there was like books, probably different artwork, more sculptures, just stuff. And then there's actually one summer, it was the summer before my family moved out of New Mexico to Santa Barbara, where my mom was working in the archives, and it was before Solstice had started. And I was helping her like catalog all of Yogi Bhajan's coins.
Wow.
Yeah. But I also don't know if I should say this, but it's fine. But basically, like, my mom, since she was kind of like, she knew that she was being like screwed over all these years in her work, she wanted to pay me like a good salary before she like quit her job, essentially. And so, like, she took like money from the donation bin in the dome and like gave me some of it in order to compensate me for my work. But it was like she paid me well though, like a good salary. Like I think it was like $20 per hour that I was working. And but she kind
Because
of
you're
like
saying you're saying that I'm just trying to get a picture here. You're basically saying that the dome and all of his clothing and all of his statues and all of his belongings and all of his jewelry and all of the gifts and anything that this is all still there.
well, I don't
Like
know about now, but like
archiving.
in 2019 it was.
2019 is not that long ago. So let's just pretend I'm talking about 2019, the last time. You're saying in 2019, all of this is how it was, and it's kind of like
Oh
preserved in time, and the legacy and the mythology that's story told through the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yoga
And
classes
then
is, and so there's a donation box, like kind of like a student can come and witness YB's dome and the space
actually
and
no,
like,
no, no, like students aren't allowed in it.
okay, so who
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
to
like no,
visit
because essentially like I think only like people who kind of have like quote unquote status.
in our community?
Yeah,
So
because like I
status
don't.
in 3HO Sikh Dharma, meaning like they're of the lifestyle.
Yes, but I don't even think, not necessarily even of the like the lifestyle, because like my mom was able to go in there because like it was like her job, and so anyone that she like then invited in was like allowed to go in. So like me and my sister, or like me and my dad also. And then so anyone there who was like working at the dome was allowed to go in. And I think also like sometimes like people were allowed to go in to meditate there. But I also know that there was every year like they would have like the KRI teacher training, stuff like that, but they like those yoga students like were never allowed to go in the dome. Like those people like they like why would they go in the dome? But I think that my mom she told me that she was doing this work because they wanted to make it into a museum or something like that.
I can
But
imagine. So
but then she
fascinating.
like but then she quit her job and she left, and so it's not like she's doing like my parents haven't been like doing the work for a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, but still so interesting because what I remember when I was teaching at a yoga studio in Chicago was that kind of like there was a real mystique when a student went to the New Mexico ashram and the things that they got to do and there was a just a mystique that like stepping into like a kind of a portal in time, and then the way that trainings and kind of YB was kind of painted in the persona that was getting created to create
Yeah.
more. So you're
Yeah,
describing
yeah.
that quite well, but as a kid growing up in it, you're just kind of noticing it from the outside, like, oh
Yeah,
god,
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And also like growing up, I kind of liked like having my mom work at the ranch because like when I could have like my friends like come over to the ranch and like we would go to the pool. Like my mom would let us do that all the time. And like go to the pool with my friends and stuff like that. Sir Atma and Sir Joe. And so it was always like really nice that I had like a way to use the pool and stuff like that.
But you're
And
saying like any family of the ashram couldn't necessarily do that. There had to have been someone
no,
in some status. You didn't necessarily
like
get
if you
access to
lived
the
if
ranch.
yeah, if you lived like at the ranch, you were able to use the pool, but like not necessarily like any family could get into the ranch. I don't know how it is now, but also like sometimes there were exceptions if there was like an event or like a party at the ranch, and so like everyone would come, but like my mom would also just like have like me and like my friends just use the pool too. Like
Hmm.
no worries about that.
So tell us about the time in New Mexico. You had mentioned that she was working in the archives up until the time she decided to leave. Why? What was the overall kind of feeling, and why did your family decide to leave New Mexico and go to Santa Barbara?
Like my mom just really like didn't like her job anymore because she wasn't doing work that she felt like happy doing because she really liked the properties, I think, but then like she got like completely like shut out of that and then like was
So
forced.
let's talk about that. You had mentioned that she was doing her job too well. So you're basically saying when she was doing her property work and she liked it, and then who made the change? Like who moved her out of that position? Do you know?
I don't like because it was like I don't necessarily know. I think I heard some names growing up, but I think I also don't remember like their names, but
You're
like I
basically
just
saying when that happened, though, she got shut out of that and just switched over, and it was just kind of a sudden thing, and
yeah,
she had to just deal with it. There was not, she never really
yeah.
got a lot of explanation itself, or she didn't necessarily share that with you.
Well, I think like she did, but she also because I heard some things, but it's also like she would talk with her friends sometimes, like after she was like when she was working in the archives, and like because she was still working at the ranch, but she wasn't in charge of the property, and she was saying like even like people coming to the ranch could notice that there was like a change in management because like the overall like atmosphere of the ranch isn't like as nice and inviting and taken care of
Hmm.
when she wasn't. That's what I mean when I was saying like she did her job really well, like she took care of the ranch
I
really
see.
well and made it like presentable.
Yeah, and just so that listeners know, I mean, obviously you're a child growing up with that perspective,
Yeah.
what the internal things that was going on with her own work, we have no idea, and
I
who
yeah.
the people were in charge at that time. But just in general, it fits the overall ethos of like there was a sudden change and she had to then be in a different position. And then
Oh
eventually it
yeah.
sounds like she wasn't enjoying it long enough that she decided that your family would move so she could get different work.
Yeah, and I think I also wanted to stress that like there she was working with like another woman in our community, and my mom had told me that like the woman was a little bit older than my mom, but she said that like the woman had to continue like working for the archives even though she hated it and she was bad at it just because she needed the money.
Mm.
And she didn't because like I know that like why especially like in the 70s and 80s like a lot of those young people like since they weren't being paid like they never set up like retirement funds or anything like that, so now they're just like completely like financially like imprisoned
Oh, you're
in
saying this older woman that has to keep working because she doesn't have any retirement benefits.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Plenty of people in that position.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Which is really like which is horrible. But it's what YB did because he just didn't pay anyone, I guess.
Yeah, and I think also just, promised that the quote family businesses would be left to the family, and yet there's a lot of children and parents that built the organizations that don't have any benefit to any of the resources that are obviously being archived and
Yeah.
making a tremendous amount of exponential
Yeah.
income.
And even like okay, yeah, so like my mom, like, so she really really like started to not like her work anymore. And then also like there wasn't really anything that really like kept them in New Mexico because we were there for my mom's work. Like my sister and I at that point, like we were both in boarding school or university, so we were never like home in the first place, or we were only home for like 3 months out of the year. And so they didn't really want to like live there anymore, and so we were like planning on moving to Toronto because that's where like I was going to school at the time, and then my mom has a lot of family there, and so we thought it was a good idea. But then like I decided to go to another boarding school in Ojai, California. And so like my family decided that it would be better if we like move not to Toronto because it's just cold and bad, but instead moved to Santa Barbara just because like that's where my dad's family is from. We had been there every year, we love it, and so
Nice.
we decided to move there. But it was kind of like a long process of moving there, and also like we couldn't like necessarily be truthful with people like that we were moving there because, for example, like I think there was one time like at Gurdwara or something where Hari Jiwan, the gem guy, he told my dad like, "Oh, I heard that you guys are moving to Santa Barbara," and then my dad goes like, "Oh, that's news to me," or something like that. Like we just didn't tell people. We were very like private about that.
And
And
is there a
then
reason? Was there a reason you didn't want people to know?
um I think it was because like it was a lot of like talk, and I think that like because I think it was also because of like some of the things that like people said to us before we left New Mexico, because like Hari Jiwan like called up my dad and said like, "Oh, like the guru wants you to stay in New Mexico, like you're not or something like that, like you're not continuing doing like what the guru wants you to do," or something like that.
Yeah, so this is the gem guy. This is the one, the chief protocol, and
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
the one that he decided to let your dad know that he wasn't following the guru's path and he should stay.
Yeah, when we were leaving to go to Santa Barbara. And then also like there was another couple who had lived in New Mexico that like my parents were friends with like in 3HO in the earlier years, Kaur and Siri. And so they had moved to Santa Barbara like a couple years before us. And they had also gotten shit for moving to Santa Barbara. So like we just didn't want to, I guess, like get as much shit. And then even I also remember like hearing my mom say that like hearing or after like the news got out that we were moving to Santa Barbara, like she was getting a phone call from like Siri or something, and she's like, "No, just like don't answer, like she's just gonna like guilt you to not leave New Mexico, like just don't do it," or something like
Sir Bro
that.
says Sir Nankar's mom, no?
I know.
Right? Okay, so, right. And back to Sir Atma's family. Bless your
Yeah,
family, y'all.
I
So, what
know.
I hear you talking about is just kind of internal community politics. Like, oh, it's kind of
Yeah,
like too close for comfort when you live in a community. Everybody's talking, trying to. And for those listeners that don't know, there's this self-proclaimed chief of protocol who had his name's Hari Jiwan, right? And he had a former. He was the gem fraud back in the like 80s, 90s, and then there was another Hari Jiwan who was the toner bandit fraud. Um,
yeah,
and anyway, so these kind of are personas, kind of these big personas in these different communities, and know that every ashram will have its own fair share of its own internal politics, and the people that are kind of the haves and the have-nots, and the important people and the not important people, and all of the people in between. And then the glue and the mesh that keeps those people together. And so these are just kind of like, I think you're painting a pretty fine picture of like what it feels like when you're growing up in something like this. And it's just, we have this kind of inner lingo, but somebody from the outside will be like, what? So it sounds
Yeah, you know,
strange.
I
But
know it.
anybody who
I
grew
know.
up in our community will kind of be like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
anyone who
totally
grows
know
up
what
in
you
our
mean.
community understands. But yeah, and then even okay, so then also like there's more stories about like our house, but about us moving to Santa Barbara. So essentially, like our house was on the market like all of Solstice, but then like the people who were buying our house like decided like a couple days before the house was supposed to sell, like we don't want to buy it anymore, so they dropped out. And so many people sent us this message like, oh, the Siri Singh sub doesn't want you guys to leave New Mexico. It's like not your time. You haven't served enough or something, all this bullshit. But then essentially like my mom put the house back on the market and she like completely restaged it because we already had like a rental house in Santa Barbara. So we thought like we're going to go there if we paid for it already. And my mom was able to sell the house for $10,000 more than what we were originally selling it for. So,
Wow. Well, I just want to put a note on that this is really the power of group think. And when one can kind of get susceptible to kind of like these lead personas and kind of like what happens in group community think, where like, it's like, oh, that must be a sign. Oh, that must be Siri Singh Sub talking to you. Oh, that must be the guru. Oh, and that this happens everywhere in the world, right? Where people are trying to pull you into like whatever they want for you. And yet here your mom just makes a definitive decision. Well, thank you very much for that input. And I'm going to go ahead and put this back on the market and keep using my critical thinking skills because I'm deciding what I want for my family. Now, I don't know your mom and I don't know the thought process, but that's what that story rings true for me.
yeah, they didn't let anyone like tell them because it's also like the people who were buying our house like the first time, they weren't a good fit. That was also a huge part of it too. And so like my mom didn't necessarily let like everyone in the community who'd been like, oh, like it's not your time to leave. She didn't let that stop her. She was like, I'm still leaving.
Well, and I want to point out that by this time, your parents are seasoned 3HOers. You know what I mean? They're not like new kids on the block. So it's like
Yeah,
after all this amount of time, she has her own opinions. She's like, I don't need your opinion on this stuff.
and then
And maybe has like a bit of more of a independent thought stream when it comes to what she's deciding.
yeah, definitely. And also like that was also at the point where like um it was at the point where I was the only one in my family who would go to the solstice celebrations every year. Like my dad and my mom like stopped going like when I was really young or
Oh,
when
you're
I was
kidding.
yeah, like when I was like a teenager, like I would just go on my own. And some like they would just come up there like at night to sleep to like be in the tent with me, or but then like there was some years where they would just have like family friends take care of me at Solstice, but like there was like a point where like they stopped going to Solstice because they just didn't like it anymore.
Yeah.
So they were
Did
very
they
they
ever
were
tell
very
you
much
why?
like they just were over it. Like like my dad didn't want to do tantric anymore. My mom did tantric like some years, or she would come up like, or it was just like the experience is a lot for like older people as well, because you're like camping in the woods, you're like, so he just wasn't interested. And my dad also has like some issues with his shoulder, and so like when he would do like some tantric exercises, like some people would also like or about like keeping his hands up, like some people like because he had a shoulder surgery when he was like in his 20s or when he was a teenager, like he physically like can't hold his arms up. And I think like he got tired of people who would be like you can't, you're not doing the exercise properly if you're not holding the arm, you're yeah, so he got tired of
Like, I don't need
it.
to hear what you have to say. I also want to say, let's just say out loud, because it's miserable. It's hot as heck up at the solstice site, right? You're miserable, you're hot, it's dry, it's dusty.
Yeah,
So anyway, kudos to your parents for deciding what they wanted, right?
but and then my mom, she would like go to tantric like just to do it with her friends, her girlfriends.
But I'm guessing that this is all after, this is all years
Yeah,
way later after
yeah,
YB
but
already
like yeah,
passed.
yeah, like way later, yeah.
So all those years, of course, they were going every year.
Yeah, because like I was also talking about this with, do you know Amar Dave from Chicago? Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, Shiva and Shabad's
Yeah,
son.
yeah. I talked to him a lot, and we were saying like a lot of like the third gen's kids in 3HO, like a lot of our lives are heavily influenced by our parents and like the way that they decide to raise us
Mm.
and like what they decide to do. Versus like we understand that like for second gen people, that's not necessarily the case because YB have just so much more of an influence in their lives. Because for us, that's just simply not necessarily the case, you
Hmm.
know? Yeah.
At least the influence is through the parents and their personas of
Yeah.
YB,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it still have that YB thing happening in your in your upbringing, but it's through the lens of the parents and the way they decided to raise.
Yeah. It's through the lens of the parents. Cause like my parents, like mostly when I was involved in like 3HO events growing up, it was like I would go to Sunday Gurdwara and then I would go to summer solstice. And then when I went to boarding school, I would just go to summer solstice. And then that was literally it. Like that was my only involvement in 3HO.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But
Except like,
still, you have a lot of connections and relationships and a whole
yeah.
world view that probably is more 3HO and YB lensed than you imagined, which we talked a little bit
Oh,
about. So
yes.
we're
Oh,
about to
yes.
bring that full circle here because I find that really interesting. As much as he didn't influence your life, the
He really
ethos
did.
and the way that it's infiltrated into the consciousness and thought process around the world is very much it has very much impacted you because the
Hmm.
break of it all has impacted you.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Definitely. And also, like, I want to stress, like, my parents and like other older members in the community sometimes like use YB's teachings to teach me, if that makes sense. So I can give an example. Like for example, when I was like in high school, I was gonna go to Six Flags in California with like one of my family friends from 3HO in Los Angeles and like City Huddy. You know her? She's really, yeah.
I don't know if I know her unless she's my age. Then I know her.
Um, no, she's like first gen, but essentially like she told me once like I was wearing like short jean shorts and she's like, wow, like Yogi Bhajan would be absolutely like horrified if he saw what you were wearing and stuff like that. Like it's just so unladylike, like you should go change or something like that. And I was just like, oh my God, I didn't know what to like do. And so like I did go change, but she was kind of like slut shaming me for what I was
Right.
wearing, but also adding in like Yogi Bhajan.
Yeah, she used his name in the name of making it publicly acceptable to shame you
Oh
because of the
yeah.
way you're dressing. And so you did go change and then was she like
Well,
the
I changed.
guide? Is she the one
I
taking
changed.
you or what? Who was she? Who
Well,
is
she was like she wasn't the one who was taking me, but she was like coming with us.
who is she? She was an older adult.
No, but she's just like an older adult in our community.
Got it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
but she's just like very opinionated.
totally typical too.
Oh God, if she's listening to this now.
We love you.
No, but also like even like my mom telling me like she's told me like growing up like men rape girls, so you really have to be like careful with what you wear and stuff like that. She's told me that before. And I can see like that is also like from the teachings that Yogi Bhajan taught. Like I could see like how she gets her like viewpoint on that.
Mm.
And then another one is that there was another like the other woman in our community who lives in Santa Barbara. Like I was having a conversation with her about like rape and sexual assault, and she's like, but I just don't believe that like men can like not go through with their urges if they have them. Like they just have to like go through with them. Like men just can't control their urges. And I'm like, yes they can.
Who said this?
This was another lady in like a first gen lady in 3HO who lives in Santa Barbara.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
horrified. I'm horrified.
Yeah. And I was telling her like that's not the case, like because but it's like it's so interesting because now I feel like I have to like reteach them.
Good luck.
Just because that I feel like all of these women, like my mom City Huddy and like the other lady in Santa Barbara, like they all learned these things from Yogi Bhajan and they're trying to like teach them on me, but because of like of out external sources and stuff like that, I've learned that this isn't true. And so it's like hard to kind of like reteach them to my mom and to all these like, I guess it is hard for like the first gen to like realize that a lot of the stuff like, or a lot of the stuff that they were learned like isn't true, or it's very dated.
Yeah, that's putting it nicely. That's putting it nicely. So bring us to present time. So what happened in 2020 for you when Prem, like, lead us up to like when the big change, your family moves to Santa
Okay, yeah.
Barbara, but lead us up to the 2020 shift, because
Okay,
you
yeah.
think that's a lens, that's a now lens,
Okay,
not
sounds
a
good.
year ago lens.
So essentially, like in 2019, I was working at Khalsa Youth Camp, and I was working with Dave and like some other guides, and we were kind of like joking around, like, yeah, like this is a cult. Like at KYC, like in 2019, before all this shit came out, we are like joking around, like, this is a cult. We're like, it's a good cult. Like, it's not bad. Like, there's a lot of like good teachings, and there's a lot of like good people here. So it's like, but it's good. But that's what I got from it.
Mm.
And then like in 20, like I also remember hearing like being in that was my senior year of high school, and I was like, in that fall, I was in the car with my mom, and she was like on the phone with someone about like, and there was like all this shit going down where she was like, no, the allegations that coming through like were not credible. Like, why are these people like like she was on the phone, like, but I was in the car, but I was just supposed to listen, like I wasn't supposed to say anything. But she was talking about how like the allegations aren't credible or something, because like I think stuff was like starting to come out. And then in like March of 2020, I think that's when like Premka's book came out, and I think I started to like research a bit more. And that's also like when I started to move, that's when I moved home to like live with my parents because of COVID. So and then like I was just kind of like hanging out, and like I was like reading a bit more about 3HO. And then I also read like the Olive Branch report when it came out, and I was like very like horrified.
Yeah.
And I thought that like when the Olive Branch report came out, like, no, also like, how do I say this? Like, even when I was in high school, I knew that I wasn't gonna like continue with the name like Harkrishan going into the future, just because like I had never liked how it was so complicated and so hard to spell and pronounce, because like so many other like of my friends in the community had like much simpler names, or they were able to go by like Siri or something like that. And so I was always like kind of like, oh, like why don't I have that?
You can't
And
go
so
by
I knew,
har.
yeah, no, I don't like that either. And so I never, I knew I was going to change it at some point, but I just didn't know when. And I remember when I was in 10th grade, my family, or my mom and my dad and I went to go visit like my aunt in Oregon. And she told me that she changed her name from Carol to Corey, or when she was in university, she started to call herself like Corey instead of Carol. And so she was like saying like, oh, like when you maybe like you should do that when you get to university or something like that. And so I was like thinking about calling myself Chris because it's in Harkrishan. But then but then like I never went through with that. And it's also not me, so I'm glad I didn't go through with that. And then like before I started university in the summer of like 2020, I was like researching different names to try out and like what names would be good for me, because because like I was also stressed about like going to a new school and having to like, I thought that like going to a new school would be like the best place to like tell everyone like my name is this, instead of having to tell like a whole bunch of like people that I already know like that of my new name.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so this is all in 2020?
Yeah, this is like in
2000.
20. Yeah, when I like like I started to kind of like think about it in 2018,
So this
and then
was
like
earlier, right?
yeah, and then like in 2020 is when like I really acted on it.
Okay, so what happened in 2020 when you read the AOB report, you started reading all the things, you started doing
And
research. Were you
I
talking to
just
your
knew.
parents? I mean, like, you pissed?
No,
What is
well,
your
like,
feeling like? What's happening
oh,
then? Are
I
they
don't
paying
talk to my
attention?
mom.
Yeah, like,
I
tell
don't talk to
us.
my mom. I don't talk to my mom about this at all, but I talk to like my dad about it sometimes. like, but not necessarily like a lot, because like I think where his perspective is now is like I think he knows that it's just really like that the community that he joined wasn't necessarily what wasn't necessarily what he thought it was. But I think it's just too painful for him to like to dive deep into that,
So he's
because then
not, he just kind of is holding
well,
it.
I actually don't know though, because he did say that he started to go to a therapist because so he could. I don't know though,
Sure.
but
That's his
back
process.
then, yeah, back then, like I asked him about the olive branch report, and like I think my dad, he adds a little bit of his side of the story where he kind of like was like, oh, like, but I don't know how accurate it is and like all this stuff. But he kind of like adds a little bit of like his side of the story, because I
Well,
also
let me
told him that
pause you. Let me pause you because that doesn't really sound like his side of the story. It sounds like a bunch of people's sides of their story that are sharing a very old narrative. So I want to just
Mhm.
pause that and just give us context. Are you basically saying that when you first heard about the quote, your mom on the phone saying, these are old, unfounded allegations. From that point, when it got more and more, the AOB report came out, were your parents in this denial and not paying any attention, or were
Okay.
they paying some attention and kind of questioning the credibility, which
Yeah.
obviously some people were, which
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just want to
I'll,
pause and just say, it's not really questioning the credibility. It's just a very old 80s narrative where
oh
anybody that
yeah.
ever came out always got questioned. But go ahead.
I'll explain. Okay. So yeah, when my mom was like on the phone, I also wanted to believe that they weren't true. Like it was too hard for me to believe that they were true. So even then, like I was kind of like, oh, like that didn't happen. But then like as I started to dive deeper into them, I realized like, yeah, it's probably more likely than not that these all happened. My mom is much more like vocal, and she cares much more about it than my dad does. My dad, like, I think like when I was telling him about the AOB report, like he was telling me that he didn't think it was like credible, because he was telling me about like another person in the community who kind of like tested the AOB report to kind of like see if they would listen to their story. But my dad just told me about it, but it's not like, he just told me that because that's just what he heard, but he doesn't necessarily care enough to like go to AOB and like test their credibility and to like hire lawyers and stuff and to like discredit AOB. That's more my mom.
She does want to, she's not believing it and believing the credibility of that organization, you're trying to say?
Yeah, like my dad, like he's in the 80s narrative, but he doesn't like care enough to act on it.
But your
And
mom's fully in that.
yeah, like she's in the 80s narrative, and she like, because also when I went home in December, she was like talking with her other friend about like how what they're doing at the AOB is like illegal.
Yeah, okay, so let's just pause here. I want people to have context because thank you for giving us the understanding of the position of where your parents were at, because a lot of people, quote, within the community kind of took this position in the sense that the organization that SSSC and all the body of companies within our community hired was called the Olive Branch. And the Olive Branch, and the reason that organization got hired was because after the book came out by Pamela Dyson, the Premka book, then a flood of other testimonies of sexual assault, physical sexual violation, rape, and other situations started flooding the internet in this Facebook group. And this is back in March 2020. And then more and more, and these were young women I knew. I was reading reports of people that I knew, and I was blown away. And I remember as more and more of this came out, it blew my mind that there could be a bunch of people that, quote, didn't believe it. But then I realized, of course they don't believe it because they haven't read what I've read. They're not reading this young woman I grew up with tell this story, or another young woman that I grew up with tell this story, or another young woman that I grew up with tell this story, or another person from the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. So what happened was literally like this immediate blockade of this group of people that came out that said, I think they called themselves the Fair Investigation Group. And this group is still a very alive and well. And they basically, Gurterit and his wife Jivan Jyoti, I think, they were like the original chancellor lawyers of YB, and they kind of like added this credibility about why the investigation isn't of legal stature. But the point was, it wasn't a legal investigation. It was a chance for.
It wasn't legal in the first place, right?
Well, the point was that wasn't the point. It's not.
Yeah, it wasn't
not in the court of law. It wasn't being persecuted. So there was a whole thing around whether this was done right. The point I want listeners to hear is that AOB wasn't the solution anybody wanted. It was a flood of testimonies of our young women, our girls, children that were born in our community, that were literally speaking their truth of being sexually violated over many, many years, many groomed, and in 10-year periods of time plus. And it was so evident that there were multiple stories coming out at one time that SSSC, the Siri Singh Subcorp, needed to take some action to try to do something, because these young women are women from our community that were born and bred like me and you. But people like your parents just shut down. It was kind of like Blinder City, and just immediately kind of focused on whether or not the validity of the way this particular organization went about their business to collect testimonies was a right, lawful way. That's not what's at question amongst our conversation, because these are our women, these are our children, these are our children, the ones we sing about and have had mantras about for decades, to raise our children in pure consciousness, and to find out that our own women and our own children were sexually groomed to be in concubine and have mutilation of their own bodies because of situations that YB put them in. It was horrifying and horrible to read.
It was like, and that's also partly like, I think why I when I first heard about like the allegations, like I didn't want to believe that they were true, because it's easier to believe that they're not true than to actually go dive into them.
Yeah, and I want to point out that when you're in the community, there is a very unconscious kind of survival response to say anybody who speaks bad or says X, it automatically isn't true. It's like a lizard brain response. That's not true. And yet young people generation, any one of us that read a particular testimony of another young person, like we knew these were our people.
Yeah. And the way that like I even told my dad that I read Premka's book, and he's like, oh, like why'd you waste your money on that or something like that, because he obviously like hadn't read it or heard like her side of the story at all. But what really like kind of like added to the validity of Premka's story was, I think like I also read, I don't think her story is out to the public, but it was the one that's in the second gen Facebook group. The woman who was, I forget her name, but she was also another secretary. Same story, like different, like couple years later, same shit. I was like, what? They probably never even like talked to each other, but they were telling each other like the same stuff on the paper. So how can two women who've like never met each other before like lie about that?
And the protocol, the things that were done, like each story, like that's what's so fascinating about reading the different ones, was that the grooming, the processes, the gaslighting, the tendencies, the abuse, the shaving of the pubic hair, the other types of things. These things are they're cookie cutter systems, and they're happening to multiple women.
Yeah, he didn't teach like women of our community that they should shave their pubic hair, only like the women that he was sleeping with.
Only the women he was controlling and abusing. And that's what I
Yeah,
found so horrible about reading some of these
yeah.
stories was the amount of fear that I've held in my body around cutting my hair or making choices
Oh my
around
God.
getting a Brazilian wax or a bikini wax or my legs or my underarm. The amount of conversations I had to have with my father to philosophize on why that was a choice of my own agency, even well into my adulthood, to be able to make choices like having a hairstyle that's sexy or to make choices for sexiness is
Yeah.
something that I wrestle. It's something that's in an indoctrination that's instilled in us from young. So to have that be a form of the abuse is so mortifying because it's so twisted. There's such a psycho twist around it.
No, and there's so much like hypocrisy that even like now that I'm thinking about it growing up, because like, okay, so literally like, okay, when we at KYC, like when we would go to the ranch, we would go to a tour and hear story, like the kids would hear stories about Yogi Bhajan. And there was one about like when he was really sick and he was on a diet. Here, I'm just gonna grab my computer charger. He was really sick, he was on a diet, and he went to the movies, and because he wanted to get like popcorn or something. And like with his diet, he was only allowed to have like a little bit of popcorn, like with salt, no chocolate, no M&Ms. But he was able to like convince one of the like little kids to like get the like movie theater to put like a lot of like M&Ms into the popcorn. And so like during the movie he would like eat like all like M&Ms during the popcorn, like with the popcorn while he was like watching the movie, and no one knew about it. But then also at KYC they told us this story about a child who like didn't like the oatmeal growing up at KYC, and so he told Yogi Bhajan that at the presentation, and then Yogi Bhajan like didn't let this child have breakfast for like every day of the camp until like in order to let this like child think about how like thankful he is for the food that he like has, even though like Yogi Bhajan can't even like eat his popcorn without chocolate.
You're talking about the hypocrisy of the chocolate. Well, it's interesting, that story, because that story is told. I remember that story told in, yoga classes. And it's like, again, it's this nostalgia story around, the sick man who was actually like gluttonous and abusing and living in hypocrisy, of course, but dying of diabetes and kidney issues, and and
Yeah,
these things aren't
it's
even
like, but
told
he,
publicly. And then the choices to paint him as this amazing
yeah,
persona.
I knew that he died of like diabetes, and I knew it was because he ate like shit.
Yep, and sucking people's life force.
Yeah, like he wasn't a healthy person.
Yeah, so all this comes open. It's obvious you're starting to research. When you reached out to me, it was pretty evident that you were beginning to wrestle and look into things and read, and your parents weren't going to, and
Well,
you
I
just
just,
decided to just move forward and just start. At least that's what your reach out to me was. And you were like, thank you for the podcast. They're really helping me research
yeah,
myself more.
yeah, definitely, because like well, I think it was like I started to see that your podcast had come out like when I came home for Christmas break in like 2020 2021, and like I started listening to them a lot more. And it's just like, well, when I listen to some of them, not a lot of them, like I do like match with a lot of the feelings, and I have like a lot of the same emotions. But it was also really interesting because I listened to, I think, Siri Neuronkar or series. It's just
I know.
interesting because I knew
I
him as
call him
like
Siri Naronkar, but you know him by Siri because he's the
no,
he's
no,
the father of your friend, right?
no, I know him by Siri Neuronkar too, but now I know
Oh.
he goes by Siri. So I don't know, but because I know so many other series, like I know that's not specific enough.
Yeah, at least when you're talking amongst us, when we know what we're talking
Yeah, it's
about, right?
not specific enough, but I listened to his story and I was like, oh my God, I never knew any of this. And then I listened to like Jimena's story, and it was also really interesting when I listened to hers because she was talking about like her experience in India.
Yeah.
And like growing up, like I think she was saying like it's just such a boys club there. So like when the incident did happen, like she just didn't have like anyone to go to talk about it. But like growing up, like I've heard from people like, oh, like that's because like the girl told Dion, like Dion doesn't know anything or something like that. Like what would she do? Like that's what I was told growing up by like other peers. But like hearing it from like Jimena's side of the story, like she literally didn't have anyone to tell. So it was like really interesting, like seeing like the difference.
Whoa, that's so fascinating. You're just saying what your peers said. Why would they tell Dion?
Yeah, but I think it's also because like she even mentioned like she didn't go to MPA and like she kind of like well she wasn't born into 3HO but she kind of like joined it herself, I think.
Yeah, yeah, when she
But
was
I
like
think that but
16.
I
But
think that's what no, but I think that's why like because she didn't like have that necessarily like status that she like went to MPA, that's probably why she wasn't like as that I think that's why they like made those comments against her and stuff like
got it. Yeah,
that.
like she didn't really have an in, right. To
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Hmm.
So interesting. So tell us where you are now. Let us know. We heard the European siren go by, so you're obviously not
Yeah.
in the United States.
No, now I'm in Switzerland. So essentially like my sister went to university in Switzerland. She's like 4.5 years older than me, like 4 years academically older than me. But she went to university in Switzerland, and then like with COVID, she told me like you shouldn't go to UCSC and live at home and like do classes online. You should like come to Switzerland so you're able to like get away from our parents because like also like our parents I don't know, like my sister and I like never like once we were like 12, like we weren't living at our parents anymore because we went to boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
Because so it's also interesting to see like I know that like YB said like to send to the kids to boarding school so they're able to get away from like their parents' neurosis or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like my parents, they didn't send us to India, but they still like send us to boarding school. Um,
Yeah.
but but still like I think that boarding school was like a much better way of like growing up than like actually going to like and living with my parents. So maybe like YB was right by like getting away from my parents' neurosis.
Well, I mean, there's a long history of people making choices to send their children to boarding school, so that's not the question. But there are also boarding schools that have, the support systems and,
Oh yeah, yeah.
that really support the education as well as the mental health of our children. So
Oh yeah, yeah.
it's also just a long, again, ethos of what I find so fascinating about kind of the generation of your parents, that first generation that's kind of still in the trenches of the community, so to speak, is just how much kind of the ethos of the teachings do influence choices and kind of ways and views of life. And it's kind of like a bit of a non-engagement. It's kind of like engagement but not, right? So it's like not paying, I'll just not look at that. Is that still the lens of where your parents are at with this, or are they paying any more attention to some of the stories? Like, I mean, even using the word allegations horrifies me because they're not allegations, they're survivor stories. They're
Yeah.
the courage of survivors to come forward and tell their abuse story without getting anything in return except for more abuse and more gaslighting and more neutrality based spiritual bypassing that's actually horribly rooted in predatory behavior that's directly related to Kundalini Yoga 3HO teachings, that they don't have to be. We can unroot
Yeah.
them from these teachings if more people will wake up and realize these are predator based practices based on gaslighting and victim shaming. To not believe people coming forward with a courageous story, to not even listen, is a part of predatory behavior. It's a part of silence culture.
It really is. It really is. Yeah. My dad, like I think he has gone through like I think with him like it's more like I guess I could see him maybe like listening to stories, but with my mom is just like so I have no idea if she would. Because she's just all she's still in like that denier, like because she's actively like trying to like disprove the claims. So like I just because my dad just doesn't care enough to do, I guess, either side of the story. Because also like my
But your
dad,
mom's literally a part of an active team trying to dismantle the credibility?
I think it was like she was talking about it and she was agreeing with like the team that was trying to dismantle it.
That's
Yeah,
horrible. I
I
can't even
know.
believe that there's a team. I mean, I do know there is a team, but like listeners, seriously, there's a team of people trying to discredit. And it's just so sad because one thing that I think rings loudly true when read the AOB report and all the other stories, whether it's the children or any other layer of story that we've heard, financial corruption and abuse and spiritual and psychological abuse. What's so evident is that reading, I mean, we're talking about maybe 35 women and then 10 that had like real specific similar stories about the sexual abuse violation.
The stories that they tell are so similar.
But I mean, I'm just talking about that's just the AOB, right? They're so similar.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious. These are different people coming forward anonymously. And, you don't even know who it is. It's very dry because it's like, everyone's a number. But my point is I think anyone reading it that really takes that in realizes, wow, this isn't even close to half of the women we
No,
know have been hurt. Like, this is a
no, yeah.
small portion of the 50 years of stories that have probably happened.
And I was even telling my dad because he was like, "Oh no," and he was like, "And no," and I think I told him like, "Oh, it's not just like the allegation. It's not just the allegations. It's also the fact that like and my parents like they were around this. They can't. It's not necessarily that they can deny it. Like it's the fact that like he forced parents to like swap like
Children.
kids with each other. It's the fact that he like sent kids to, they also know about like the bullying that has gone on at MPA. So it's not like they like it's the fact that there's like the bullying that goes on. That's like also like why like we're talking out, or we're not just talking about like necessarily just Yogi Bhajan. We're talking about like all the things he did to like the community.
Yeah, and when
Yeah.
one's entrenched in a lifestyle, we have to just know that, cognitive dissonance is real. So when something like comes up against like our rooted belief system and what we thought and the way we saw the world, that place of cognitive dissonance, somebody can spend their entire life in that place and hopefully get support to move beyond cognitive dissonance to realize, wow, what's in plain sight is right there, but it's cracking my whole code of the way that I see the world, and that's got to be hard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we hold your parents up in the light, and hopefully they have all the support they need to begin to pay attention.
Yeah.
But I thank you and your voice. I thank you and your willingness to be uncomfortable and speak out loud. And I know that you started writing about it and kind of doing presentations just to help break open your own self around like
Because
this is a
yeah.
cult and it's not a good one. There may be
Yeah.
good parts, but it's not a good cult.
Yeah, because I also like sometimes I tell people here like, yeah, like I was raised in a cult, but I can't necessarily like and they're like, tell me about it. I'm like, okay, like where do I start? And so that is why like I made a presentation to kind of like guide my thinking about it, because a lot of people at my university do want to listen to this podcast. I hope they do. I
Um,
also okay, I also made a note here, and I thought it'd be interesting to mention. It would be interesting to mention, but I also heard like I found out a bit about like Guru Dev, and I found out that like I
no,
was actually the
pause. I don't know who you're talking about. You got a context who Guru Dev is. Lots of Guru
Guru
Devs in the
no
world.
no the Guru Dev Satnam Rasayan.
Got it. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, okay. I was the guide of his grandkids
Oh,
for years.
okay. Okay. And you knew him then, or you didn't necessarily?
Nope. No, I did not know him at all. Thank
Oh,
goodness.
okay.
But I knew his grandkids.
And did you find out about his abuse, his predatory behavior just from listening to the podcast, or did you know
Yeah,
from
just
before?
from listening to the podcast, and then listen, like I think there was like the mom's story, which I read like part of, not all of it. And
You mean
then
Olivia's mom, Marina?
Yeah, Marina's mom. Yeah, oh yeah, Marina. And then
That's
I
another,
was
that's the
listening,
woman that was abused and wrote an abuse story about from Guru Dev
and
Singh
then
over many
and
years.
then I did listen to Olivia's podcast, and then
That's
I
her
was
daughter.
looking, yeah, and then I looked at the Facebook comments of like someone asking how Gurudev died because they thought he could have been, because no, because she said that because his time of death and the time when his allegations came by were like too close together, where she wondered if something happened to him. That's why she asked it. When I was reading the comments, and I like found out who like his daughter was, and I knew his daughter because I remember like she was a mom of like two kids that I had watched growing up, so I was like, oh god.
Yeah, so for you, that's got to be trippy, right? You're like, oh my gosh, just like kind of like how your life unfolds and your connection to these things, and yet distance, and just kind of like piecing it all together. It's got to feel like a little puzzle piece ish.
Yeah, it really is. But yeah, so I just like it kind of like blew my mind when I found out that like the grandfather of these like two kids who are so sweet and like innocent and like that's their grandfather. I was like, oh my god, no.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to, as we listen to these stories and we hold our own family members that may or may not, quote, be paying attention and listening, that even have horrible things to say, like words like allegations or words like, I'm not sure if I believe that. Like, these are old language rooted in predatory positioning that basically create an ethos around not paying attention to manipulation and abuse that has a long, long, long history. And this is why I call it the 80s narrative, because when these stories started coming out and
Oh
I
my god.
heard that that group existed, that there was a group of people, quote, just full on denying it, it was literally like I was 8 years old and I was
Again.
85, right? I was like 85. It was
Oh,
1985
I think that
and
was
Premka
like
was leaving. And this was the narrative I remember playing out. So to
okay.
hear it spewed now in 2020 shows that there's just like this consciousness frozen in time. And anytime there's abuse that's spoken, it's like people are reverted back to this kind of like hypnotized state of being in the mid 80s and
Yeah,
not paying
yeah.
attention, like the propaganda
Yeah,
around
they're
it.
not paying attention at all. And I was even looking at like our family friends like in Facebook, and she sent like she shared a post like, and it was a post like supporting Yogi Bhajan, and they're saying like, and it was about this, it was written by this one guy in 3HO in New Mexico, and he was saying like, oh, like what was he saying? He said that he used to work for the mission. He said he used to work for the mission, which is also very like cult like to say in your paragraph, because it's like, okay, you're already saying that you're like not like living your own life. You're that you're like doing all, you're living your life for this man. And then they say that like, oh, like some women when they don't get what they want, they would like lash out. But it's like,
This is
if you read
gaslighting
if
101. That's
if
right
you
out of
read if you
gaslighting
like,
book.
yeah, if you read Premka's story, like all she wanted was to like get married to a man, like no, literally to get married to a man. I think that's what she wanted. I think was his name Siri Brahma, and then
Without
like
even going into her story, just hearing
yeah,
language like that is classic victim
yeah,
bashing language. Like, watch any movie from the early 80s, and this is the classic lingo. It's called rape culture. Rape
mm,
culture. And what has happened is in our community, rape culture has become so normalized and disguised as wise man talk. So, wise yoga teachers, even women, will have wise man talk. And they'll talk to women as if they're
it's
men. And
no,
we
that's
do
yeah,
that. We do that because we learned that. We learned that because we learned that vulnerability in our community is not safe. Sharing how
oh
you
yeah,
feel is not safe. So we use this masculine persona of abuse and shame. And whenever you hear that language, if you have parents that are still in the community, if you have friends or family that are still in the community and they're using this language, it's not that helpful to fight it. You just have to learn to recognize it better, because it's classic gaslighting. And there's language for gaslighting now. There's whole therapy around narcissism, and you can start learning the language so you can detect this stuff better, because it's deeply, deeply rooted in predatory, manipulative behavior to control thinking. And this is why yoga students are susceptible when they come into our community, because we have this wise man persona that permeates the teachings, regardless of whether women or men are spewing this grace of God nonsense.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. And then I was also thinking that like the reason, or so a lot of people ask me like, well, how would people get like involved in this community if you tell me like how bad it is? And I'm saying like it's very easy, because like the yoga itself, like when people do it, like it gets people very like high. And especially like when Yogi Bhajan would like teach in the past, like it got people very like high, and then like he would like teach his lectures and like brainwash all of them, and they're all like following it, just like that whole cycle of like the yoga, the lectures, the lecture. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you do extended, certain breaths, and the whole goal is to shoot out of your body into super consciousness, and we're over activating our will. I mean, there's just certain things in a part of the formula that's quite deeply embedded. And it's important to also understand that even within, quote, the teachings, there are some neuroscientifically based things that, when extracted from the predatory patterns that YB has infused into all of this, can be neurobiologically helpful. But if we're not taking the time to break it apart, and we're not seeing this formula that's all infused in it all, it's to me it feels very predatory in the marketing. Like I don't like that there's a formula to kind of like wrap people into the ethos of Sikh Dharma. Get a name, wear a turban, change
Wear
life,
white.
wear white, come into our special world, and you're
Go to
not
yoga
as
classes.
special if you're not as like us. And the
You're more superior. Yeah.
so it's like the
And
spiritual
so no,
superiority is sold.
people like my friends even telling me like here, like they're like, yeah, you're kind of like a little bit self-centered. And I'm like, but they understand that it's not that I do it naturally, but it's just because of like the way that like I grew up, where we were told like, yes, you're very much more like superior because you have this like kundalini yoga technology. Like we grew up with that.
You remember that. You remember growing up
And
with.
also, my name means the princess who is God herself.
Awesome.
Like the name Harkrishan, so I was just like, wow, yeah.
Embody that name, sis.
But it's also funny because it's just all because it's like Yogi Bhajan talks about like, or I remember growing up hearing like, oh, like everyone like it's not good to have a huge ego, but like oh, he had such a big ego.
Yeah, the contradictions is a tough one. I know that as we're unrooting the complexity of what is good and not good and just all this stuff, it can feel like a psychosomatic mind fuck is what it can feel like. It can just feel like chaos inside, and I think that's just a part of it. Like it's like, wow, it's like right in plain sight. It's like when the truth and the lies are in plain sight, and what happens internally, unwinding that level of stuff just takes time. So be compassionate with yourselves. Take the time, keep listening, keep speaking out loud, do more research on cults. It's very, very helpful, especially from an academic point of view. I find that the academic reading on high demand groups, and the impact of being, say, a second generation or a child born into high demand groups, it's very helpful. I found to get perspective, and I know that this has supported you as we've
Yeah.
engaged.
Yeah, definitely with my writing class at my uni, I've been doing some research about cults And like, well, especially because I found that like with my writing, I'm much better if I'm more interested about it. And because I'm so interested about cults, it's like easier about for me to write about it. So I've just been like researching more about it. And I watched this TED talk about like why do people join cults and what is a cult. And I'm just like, when I'm watching it, it's just like, yes, this was a cult because we had a leader. There was an inner circle. Everyone has to have like a high level of focus and what's the word? Uh, Focus and like
Well,
I forget the focus. Yeah.
there's a whole checklist. So I highly just encourage everyone to go check it out themselves. But it's more than that. It's when certain choices of our life are dictated. And when we're growing up in something, we don't really understand the impact. But I know that a lot of listeners and a lot of people that may or may not be listening are going through the level of cognitive dissonance where it's like, even if you want to say I don't believe that, you realize how much of your own psyche is still wrapped up into kind of an ethos of the way of
Yeah.
being and living in the world. And just know that takes time. There are lots of us like myself or my brothers or different stages where people have been slowly leaving over years, and leaving isn't the right word, but it's more like clearing the psyche of what it means to grow up
Yeah.
in this kind of thing. And it just does take time. So supporting the but knowing cult language helps. And the other thing is also learning about gaslighting and learning about what these kind of languages are supports you to be dealing with, say, a loved one or a family member that might still be very much not paying attention to the stories of our own people.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing because you can't make somebody listen, and you can't make somebody change, and you can't make
Yeah.
somebody see. But you can do your
Mhm.
own work and your own unraveling, and you can allow yourself to be penetrated, right? To,
Yeah.
to crack open enough to start remembering yourself.
Yeah. And a lot of like even now I feel like I'm starting to learn more about it, like with some of the language that my mother texts me, because there was one thing that she texted me once like like a couple weeks ago, and it made me really really upset because she was telling me like, stay in the light, be who you are. But she doesn't actually mean that. She means like you're kind of like straying a little bit off of like the 3HO path, and I can see it, but I don't want you to do that. So she's kind of like, that's what I interpreted it to be like, because
Well, and you get to then work that one out with your mom along the way.
it's
Oh,
it's
fun.
also really interesting because like my dad's family was like never accepting of him becoming a Sikh, but my mom's family was like so accept. It was like accepting of her. But like my dad, like when I told him like, oh, like I changed my name and I like got a haircut, he's like, okay, whatever.
And are
He's
they
like,
not
you
together anymore, or are they still
no,
together?
no, no, they still
They
they
are.
still are.
Okay. It's just
Yeah.
different. Okay.
Yeah. And then my mom was just like, I did not, I haven't told her I changed my name. I haven't told her I cut my hair.
Okay. I'm guessing they
Because
don't listen to this podcast, huh?
well, I'm hoping that they don't. Well, I hope they, yeah, I don't think they do.
Well, more people are listening than I think we probably know.
Yeah, probably.
So, welcome, all listeners. I want to just thank you for having the courage to kind of give us a lens into your process. I know that it can't be easy to be 19 and have all of this kind of crack open, and yet also it also has to feel liberating simultaneously. It's like, wow, who am I in this big old sea?
Because it also was like at a very, very like good time that it came out. Well, it was a little bit like convenient for me that like when the AOB report came out, because it was like right before I started university, so I was like right able to like reinvent myself.
That gave you a real definitive line
Yeah,
in the sand of what you knew to
yeah,
actually understand
yeah,
to be true.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot more stories than we've heard, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you that. And more will be happening and be coming out. So I really hope you're taking care of yourself, because you can't, again, change other people or make other people listen or make other people see. But you can absolutely learn yourself, and get more awareness within yourself about what it means to grow up in our community, and what it means to interface with people that are using gaslighting language and victim bashing language as a way to define their stance. And this is not new. It happens in political arenas, it happens in religious organizations, it happens in companies and places all around the world. We're not unique, but when spirituality is used as a way to subjugate and manipulate and abuse, it's never good. And it's all of our responsibility to speak out and to educate ourselves about how our own consciousness might support it through our silence.
And also, like, thinking about it, just capitalizing on, like, especially like in innocent, I would say, like, yoga students, because like you have to pay to get a name, you have to pay so much money for teacher training. It's a pyramid scheme. So
Well, it's just a very well operating business plan, that's for sure. And
it really
you can
is.
change the face of the marketing machine, and you can put people of color and Black, Indigenous folks, and you can start talking trauma and shadow healing language. And I know there's really good people that work with KRI and 3HO and on all these boards, and yet it's also all firmly rooted and cemented in very, very entrenched predatory behavior, with transparency not at the top of the list. And when we can really find out how much money is rolling through these organizations, it's by far larger than any one of us can wrap our heads around, which is why it's not an easy thing for SSSC or any of these orgs to actually address. Because like any yoga teacher out there, their income is firmly rooted in this marketing machine. And it is not a little piddly yoga program here or there. We are talking about serious bank and serious donations, serious amount of assets in the archives, lots and lots of assets. And as far as we're concerned, money needs to be compensated to the survivors and to the women that have been abused over decades.
Yeah. And it's sometimes like even some it sometimes pisses me off, like hearing my, I guess, like older generation saying like, oh, like, well, the survivors just want money. Okay, you don't want money either. You worked like 10 years with no money paid. Why wouldn't you want to get like compensated either?
Once again, it's not ever defending the thing they're saying. I want everyone just to remember, listen to this language, the languaging. If we can start learning the languaging of what gaslighting and victim shaming is, it's meant to put the fault back onto the person that got hurt. And what that does is it automatically starts questioning our own sense of sanity. And when we when we have a long history of incestuous abuse, family sexual abuse is much even harder, and our community is very family like. You don't even have to be related for us to relate to each other as family. So we have to really begin to understand that the complexity of the sexual abuse that has gone on, whether it's among the children or among the women direct with YB or of any other yoga teacher, is the incestuous nature of predatory abuse keeps us in silence. Because if our abuser is the father of a best friend of someone we know, these things aren't easy to ever let open and out and unravel, because we all become unconsciously complicit. Our silence breeds more predatory behavior. And so this is why I'm pausing to speak to it, because it's so easy to use language like that to say, well, oh, they just want the money. Study rape and study history of sexual assault. Women that come forward, men that come forward. There are men that have been sexually abused and incested that can't come forward because there's not space and safety, because this type of language is the ethos of our spiritual community. That's not safe. That's not compassion. That's not humanity. And we use spirituality to bypass humanity. And that's not okay.
It really isn't. Even now, like, I guess, like, when you're saying like if you're vulnerable in 3HO, like that's really, really bad. And I've realized now like it takes a lot for me to be vulnerable with people. Like I have to really, really trust you.
And this is long history of learned patterning. Our parents
Yeah.
didn't have the safety to be vulnerable. Like, what are we going to grow up in? You know what I mean? It's like they did the best they could to keep up with the chaos. I mean, it's just it's layers of traumatic impact. And so again, listeners, everyone, make sure you're getting support, but under also we have to get better at identifying language that's not supporting breaking the silence. It's
We really do.
supporting questioning the intent of somebody sharing their vulnerability. Like, you know what? Don't question somebody's intent when they're sharing the most vulnerable thing they'll probably ever speak. It's not your place to question their intent.
Yeah,
Just like you said,
definitely.
yeah, if they need money, bless them. But that's not the point, you know? And
Hmm.
the fact that we're talking about so much abuse on so many different layers and levels,
And
we don't
and
even
I just
notice our language does this. Our own language silences each other.
but yeah, I kind of wanted to just point out that even like some of their arguments just don't make sense. Be like with the money thing, like no one was like, because even like no one was paid. So yeah, it's just horrible.
Yeah. It's so many layers of horrible. But, what I've noticed is there tends to be kind of like a hierarchy of trauma language that goes on in our community. And it's kind of like, oh, well, nothing really, and it wasn't, what happened to me wasn't that bad. I mean, and we use language because we actually don't even know how to hold or wrestle with our own experiences that are.
That's even what I said to you because I was like, when I first reached out to you, I was like, hi, like I grew up in 3HO, but like since I didn't grow up with YB, like it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, and it was interesting because you didn't reach out to me to say I want to talk. You just reached out sharing your kind of your perspective, and then as the time went on, as you started unraveling more, you realized, wow, I mean, I have so many things I could share, but it's not like sharing, oh, this is what happened, but it's more like this is a lens into this experience and then this experience, and now you're seeing it differently, and that in and of itself is fascinating to hear. So this is why I thank you, because there's not like this horrible thing that happened that you came to tell, but overall you're painting a picture about a worldview that has gotten pierced, or the veil is coming down, and who are you as you float through time and space now.
Hmm. Definitely.
So it's courageous to do that, and it's also very
Yes,
vulnerable. And so you're practicing your vulnerability, I think that's beautiful.
I think it is too. Yeah, but it is really hard for me because like because sometimes it is because I had like an issue like who are like kind of like my close friends, but I realize it's the people that I can be vulnerable with.
Mm.
Yeah.
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 Well, I want to just say thank you for coming and
Of
being here and sharing with
course.
us.
Thank
It's
you for
been so
having me.
interesting. We're more than 20 years apart, so it's just so cool
I
to
know.
such different decades, and to
I
have a lot of
know, definitely.
similarities, and there's still stuff happening. It's just like, whoa, that's weird.
Yeah, definitely. But I also wanted to say too, I wanted to talk about how about Siri Atma, and like it's basically like like it's absolutely like I have like no words to say, but every night there's like a Zoom call for her that well I didn't go tonight because I like had this, but but I've gone like every night for her to do like a meditation for her, but it's been like interesting because like some a lot of like the people who have gone to MPA, like it's a time where like status doesn't necessarily matter anymore. And so like now like it doesn't necessarily matter that I didn't go to MPA. Like they just know that I love and support Siri Atma. And so like I guess it's nice to like be I get because they even invited me to like this other group text for a meditation um each week. So it's like it's in a way like I've been kind of like invited back
Hmm.
in a way because of Siri Atma.
It's always interesting how tragedy can do that, right? Can
Yeah.
kind of create space where we open up to
But
allow difference.
I do think it is very beautiful, and I love how, like, even though, like, there's so much, like, stuff going on in our community, and even, like, within her family herself, like, I think, like, it's pretty divided, and our community is, like, so divided, but that we still, like, came all together to show, like, our love and support for her, which is really, really beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our prayers go out
Yeah.
to Sir Naran Kaur and Jiva and the parents of Siri Atma, who recently got killed in a car accident. Love to everyone that is connected to this beautiful young woman, and love to everyone listening. Thank you for that share. Anything left that you'd like to share with listeners before we wrap up to your song?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. Well, let us know why you chose this song.
Okay, so I was like deciding yesterday which song I should pick because I didn't really know. But then it ended up on my playlist and it just makes sense. But it's by Beyonce. It's called Listen. If you like listen to the lyrics, it makes a lot of sense because she's essentially like mad in like when she's making the song, I think she's mad at her boyfriend for like not listening to her about like her issues and stuff like that. And like and he's kind of like putting words into her mouth, and so it's kind of like I think very similar to kind of what a lot of like the people who are trying to like tell their stories are saying, and like the other like we're just wanting the first gen of people in the denier group to kind of like just listen to us. But so yeah, that's why I chose it.
Thank you. All
Yeah.
right. So we are listening to, because of copyright, we only listen to the first few seconds of it, but you're always welcome to listen to the Uncomfortable Conversations playlist on Spotify. So here we go, listening to Listen. And listen to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast playlist on Spotify. Thank you so much for being here,
Thank you for
Harkrishan,
having me.
Mira,
Thank you for
and
having me.
you're welcome. And this concludes another episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. If you'd like to contribute to this broadcast, you can make a one-time or monthly donation at gurunishan.com/uncomfortable conversations. Also, to be a guest on the podcast, please send me an email to gn@gurunishan.com. You can subscribe and follow and support my provocative truth-telling work at gurunishan.com as well. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, we'll talk to you on the next episode.